She was more than 100 miles from the nearest town, in a winter that dropped to 40 below, raising a young daughter off the grid, and she started to wonder whether she had made a terrible mistake. That woman is Amy Westerlind, the co-creator behind Holdfast Alaska, one of the fastest-growing homesteading channels on YouTube. And the version of her story the audience sees on screen is only part of what actually happened. By the time this video is over, you'll understand not just why she came close to walking away from all of it, but why staying was the harder and more deliberate choice. Most people who find Holdfast Alaska find it through the footage, the salmon processing, the root cellars packed with mason jars, the herbal tinctures lined up on rough-hewn shelves, the kind of imagery that makes you feel for a moment that a simpler and more grounded life is within reach. What those images don't show is who Amy Westerlind was before any of that footage existed. She did not grow up in the wilderness. She was not raised on a homestead. There was no generational knowledge passed down to her, no grandmother who taught her to can venison or press elderberries into syrup. Amy came from ordinary New England life, the kind of life where your food comes wrapped in plastic and your routine is built around a commute and a desk. For years, she moved through that version of existence the way most people do, efficiently, without questioning whether it was actually the life she wanted. The questioning came later, and when it came, it didn't arrive gently. At some point in her late 20s, Amy began educating herself in herbalism. Not as a hobby, not as something to post about, as a genuine discipline, the kind that requires years of study, of sourcing plants, of understanding the relationship between what grows in the ground and what goes wrong in the human body. She became a practicing herbalist before she became a homesteader. And that distinction matters more than most people realize when they look at who she is now. The herbalism was the first signal that she was not going to live the life she had been handed. It was the first time she chose something entirely her own, something that didn't fit the script most people in her position were following. And it pointed her, though she didn't know it yet, toward a very specific kind of future. And that's when the decision was made, the one nobody around her saw coming. Before Alaska, there was Maine. That fact alone separates Amy and Dennis Westerlind from the vast majority of people who start a homesteading YouTube channel after watching a weekend's worth of off-grid content and deciding they'd like a different life. They didn't move to Alaska and start filming. They homesteaded for roughly 12 years before a single camera started rolling for public consumption. Maine was where they learned what they didn't know, and the list was long. 12 years of trial and error before the channel existed means 12 years of failed harvests, animals lost to predators or illness, food preservation attempts that went wrong, and winters that taught them, the hard way, what they hadn't prepared for. There's a reason experienced homesteaders say the first few years don't count. The knowledge hasn't compounded yet. You're still learning the cost of every mistake in real time. They had built a working base of practical knowledge, food systems, animal husbandry, herbal medicine, cold weather survival, seasonal food production, that most people never develop in a lifetime. The decision to leave Maine for Alaska was not an impulse. Dennis had talked about Alaska for years, the eastern interior, the land around Wrangell St. Elias, the most remote terrain in the country, represented something Maine could never quite deliver, a life lived entirely on nature's terms, without the softening edges that proximity to civilization always provides. Amy agreed to the move. That agreement is easy to state, but harder to fully reckon with. She had built her world in Maine. Her herbal practice, her food networks, her physical environment, all of it rooted in a place she had spent more than a decade learning. Saying yes to Alaska meant releasing everything she had spent 12 years building and agreeing to start again, in a harder place, in a more unforgiving climate, with a young daughter. Here's what the comments kept asking, and here's the answer they never got, until now. People who've never been to Alaska's eastern interior tend to imagine it through the lens of Alaskan tourism content. Glaciers, cruise ships, brown bears fishing in photogenic streams. The interior is a different proposition entirely. The area where Amy and Dennis settled near Wrangell St. Elias sits more than 100 miles from the nearest town, with a grocery store. The road infrastructure that exists is minimal and seasonal. In winter, temperatures regularly fall to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit and stay there, not for an afternoon, but for weeks. The growing season is measured in weeks, not months. What you put up in the summer and fall is what you survive on when the ground freezes and the light disappears. This is not a metaphor for hardship. It is the literal operational reality of the life Amy Westerlind is living on camera every time Holdfast Alaska uploads a video. Subsistence living in that zone means moose, caribou, salmon, and whatever can be foraged, grown, dried, fermented, or stored against the winter. It means that a failed harvest is not a disappointment. It is a logistical problem with real consequences. It means that every jar Amy processes, every tincture she makes, every root she digs up before the ground hardens, is doing real work toward keeping her family fed through months, when the outside world is essentially inaccessible. The Westerlinds chose a subsistence zone designation, which carries legal weight in Alaska. That designation restricts how and what they hunt and fish, but it also anchors them to a level of self-sufficiency that most off-grid channels are only performing. Lena, their daughter, was born at home, off-grid. That decision, made before the channel existed and before there was any audience to perform it for, tells you more about who Amy and Dennis are than any thumbnail ever could. Most people who know this story stop here, but the real story starts right now. Holdfast Alaska launched in September of 2024. Within its first year, the channel crossed 200,000 subscribers. For context, most homesteading and off-grid channels take years to reach that number, grinding through slow algorithmic cycles and inconsistent posting. Holdfast Alaska's growth rate was not normal. It reflected an audience that had been waiting, without knowing it, for exactly this kind of content. Unfiltered, skill-dense, geographically extreme, and anchored in a family doing this for real, rather than performing it. The channel's format is built around Amy's and Dennis's actual work: salmon processing, root cellar organization, medicinal plant identification and preparation, moose harvests, the physical infrastructure of a homestead being constructed piece by piece in one of the most demanding climates on Earth. The videos don't have the production polish of larger lifestyle channels. They don't need to. The realness is the product. Amy appears on camera as the primary teacher of the channel's herbal and preservation content. She walks viewers through the identification of plants that grow in the eastern interior. She explains tincture preparation, fermentation, drying, and storage techniques that have real application for anyone learning traditional food and medicine practices. Her role is not decorative. She is carrying half the channel's intellectual content, and the audience knows it. But here's what didn't come through in the early videos, and what Amy has since been more open about as the channel has grown. The moment the audience arrived, something shifted in the weight of the life she was already living. And if you think that was surprising, stay with me, because this next part is why the whole story matters. Homesteading in Alaska's remote interior is physically brutal in ways that don't fully translate through a camera lens. What you see in a Holdfast Alaska video is the completed act: the salmon filleted, the jars sealed, the herbs dried and labeled. What you don't see is everything that led to that moment: the 3-hour sessions in cold water processing fish, the back pain from a harvest that required bending over the same motion for 6 hours straight, the decision made in freezing rain to keep working because there is no option to reschedule. Amy has spoken openly across multiple episodes about the psychological weight that builds inside that kind of existence. The isolation is real. Not poetic isolation, literal isolation, where the nearest neighbor might be more than 20 miles away, and a medical emergency requires a plan that most people have never had to think through. The darkness in winter is total and long. The responsibility of keeping a child healthy and safe in that environment sits on both parents constantly, but it sits on Amy in particular ways that she has addressed directly on camera. There was a period, she has not attached a specific date to it publicly, but she has acknowledged it existed, where she questioned whether the channel itself was sustainable for her. Not the homestead, the channel. That distinction is important. Amy and Dennis were not on the verge of abandoning their life in Alaska. The homestead was not in question. What Amy confronted was the specific pressure that comes from having an audience watching while you're doing all of this. The expectation of content. The knowledge that if she was struggling on a particular week, she either had to film it or explain its absence. The feeling of performing authenticity inside a life that was already demanding everything she had. She never talked about this publicly, until now. There is a specific dynamic that plays out on every channel in this niche, that the audience rarely gets a direct window into. The homesteading content creator lives inside a feedback loop that has no parallel in conventional content creation. A beauty channel creator who has a bad week can film a different kind of video or take a break. The homestead doesn't wait. The fish are running now, or they're not. The frost is coming on a specific date regardless of whether you feel like filming. The animal that needs processing today, not when the creator is feeling camera ready. Amy's visible absences from certain episodes, something the Holdfast Alaska audience has noticed and commented on since the channel's early months, reflect this reality directly. She was not absent because of conflict or illness or some drama the channel was managing. In some cases, she was working. In other cases, she was carrying the less visible load of what it takes to raise a child in a remote environment. The education, the daily routines, the emotional scaffolding that doesn't translate into content but is the foundational work of the whole enterprise. In other cases, she stepped back from the camera intentionally, because she needed to. Amy has described in broader terms the way that constant filming can erode your relationship with the thing you're filming. When every jar of preserved food becomes a content beat, there is a risk that the act of preservation stops being what it actually is, a survival task, a deeply personal practice, and starts being something performed. For someone who came to herbalism and homesteading as a private commitment long before there was any audience, that erosion was something she had to actively resist. The number that came next, nobody who followed this channel expected it. The reason Amy did not walk away from the channel, and more specifically, the reason she found a way to stay that didn't require compromising the thing that made the channel worth watching in the first place, comes down to a distinction she has articulated on camera. She drew a line between the homestead and the channel. Not a wall between them, but a boundary that made the homestead primary and the channel a record of it, not the other way around. That sounds simple. It is not. For a channel with 200,000 subscribers and climbing, with brand partnership opportunities, membership income, and an audience that has genuine emotional investment in what happens next, the pressure to produce is constant. The algorithmic reality of YouTube is that channels which slow their upload frequency lose ground. Momentum is fragile. The growth that Holdfast Alaska achieved in its first year is not something that sustains itself automatically. It requires feeding. Amy's position, in the episodes where she has addressed this directly, is that she would rather lose subscribers than lose herself inside the content. That the channel exists to document a real life, and if maintaining the channel starts to distort the life being documented, the channel has to yield. That is not a common position for a creator with this much momentum to take publicly. Most people in her position would find a way to rationalize higher production output. The economics of YouTube push toward more, not less. The fact that Amy articulated and held a boundary in the opposite direction is one of the things that makes Holdfast Alaska different from the 50 other homesteading channels the algorithm serves alongside it. At this point in the story, most people walked away. What she did instead is the part nobody talks about. As of 2026, the channel is still active. Amy is still in it. The footage coming out of Wrangell St. Elias country shows a homestead that is more established than it was when the channel launched. More infrastructure, more developed food systems, a root cellar that reflects years of accumulated knowledge about what stores well and what doesn't. Amy's herbal content has deepened. The videos on plant identification and tincture preparation have become something closer to structured teaching than raw documentation, which reflects the audience that has grown around the channel. People who are not just watching, but learning. Lena is growing up inside that environment, and that fact threads through everything Amy produces. The choices Amy makes about what to grow, what to preserve, what skills to develop and pass on, are not abstract decisions made for content value. They are the decisions of a parent building a specific kind of life for a specific child in a specific place, and the channel documents that process in real time. The audience the Westerlinds have built is not a passive viewership. The comment sections of Holdfast Alaska are populated with people who are attempting, in their own contexts, to apply what they're learning. Viewers who are starting garden preserves. Viewers who are experimenting with herbal medicine for the first time. Viewers who are reconsidering their relationship with where their food comes from. Amy's role in that is not incidental. She is the channel's primary teacher, and the teaching has mattered enough to more than 200,000 people that they keep coming back. The channel began because Dennis had a vision for a life in the Alaskan wilderness. It has grown because Amy found a way to carry the intellectual weight of that vision on camera, without losing what made her choose it in the first place. One phone call, one conversation. That's all it took to change the direction of everything. And that single exchange between Amy and Dennis about whether the channel was worth the cost it was extracting is what reoriented how Holdfast Alaska produces content and why Amy is still in front of the camera today. Amy Westerlind did not walk away from Holdfast Alaska because the life was too hard. She came close because the camera made it harder in a way she hadn't anticipated. And the fact that she recognized that distinction, named it, and drew a boundary around it is the reason the channel is still worth watching. What comes next for Holdfast Alaska is more of what the channel has always been: a real family, in a real place, doing real work. The herbal content is expanding. The homestead infrastructure is maturing. Amy's role as the channel's primary educator is becoming more defined rather than less. The winners will keep coming at 40 below, and the root cellar will keep needing to be full before they arrive. Here's the question worth sitting with. Amy had everything she needed to justify quitting: the isolation, the physical toll, the pressure of a growing audience watching while she figured it out. She chose to stay anyway, but on her terms, not the algorithms. Would you have made the same call, or would the audience have won? Let me know below.